the warm introduction. Super happy to be here. So like Cody said, I do research at the intersection of HCI and security, focusing on the digital safety and security needs of various marginalized and vulnerable populations. Within my prior and ongoing work, I've studied many different communities that fall into this space. So various types of gig workers, sex workers, migrants, technology users in the majority world, as well as people who have experienced tech-facilitated violence. And so today in this talk, I'm going to share some of the work that I've done across a few of these groups. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about digital safety more broadly. So I want us to begin by considering 3 scenarios that illustrate various digital safety violations. Bob is consistently harassed on social media. The hateful comments and remarks that he's receiving on his posts are negatively impacting his mental health. Some of Charlie's personal images and information are being circulated on social media without his consent by an abuser. And he's afraid to tell anyone, and as a result, has begun avoiding his friends and family. And Alice is considering going on a date in a coffee shop with someone that she recently met on a dating app. She enjoys talking to him online, but she has a gut feeling that something is off, and she can't quite put her finger on it. And this worries her because the last person that she met on a dating app sexually assaulted her. These examples illustrate the broad spaces that harm can occupy as a result of a digital safety violation. Many harms that occur online can have offline consequences. For example, Bob's experience with online hate and harassment seeped into the offline world to negatively impact his mental health. And Charlie's experiences with non-consensual sharing of his information and images impacted his offline relationships with friends and family members when he started avoiding them. Similarly, benign interactions that initiate online but are mediated by a digital platform can cause offline harm. For example, Alice's otherwise positive relationship with a potential romantic partner online has the potential to lead into offline physical abuse. Now, the variety of spaces that harm can occupy makes digital safety really complex. And then adding to that already complex space are the various factors that impact how harm is experienced. So for example, the different ways in which people might use technology or the various other risk factors that might impact their potential for getting harmed. And in particular, people have different goals for using technology, such as sharing major life events or finding support. And they engage in different actions to carry out these goals. Things like posting a photo on a social media site or joining an online community. And these processes can lead to various harms that are experienced across the digital physical divide. So these are harms like the ones that we saw Bob, Charlie, and Alice experiencing. And this harm is further compounded by various risk factors like gender, race, and education level that increase people's susceptibility to harm. So now I want us to consider an example of how these different factors might work together to affect someone's experiences with safety. So take Bob. Perhaps Bob might join an online community intending to find work. And he sees a job posting with a link that could be a scam, but because of his socioeconomic status, he might feel that he is in no position to pass up on a good offer. So he clicks on the link, inputs some personal details, but unfortunately, the link ends up being malicious. The job is actually a scam, and Bob experiences financial abuse as a result. Together, these 4 components impact Bob's experience with harm. Now, Bob's story is just one example of an experience that someone might have. But there are many others that involve these various components, and understanding them, I think, is important for developing safety protections that have an adequate amount of generalization to be useful across multiple experiences. The complexity of digital safety makes developing adequate protections really challenging. On the one hand, we can develop very general protection that doesn't take into account the various ways in which these components might impact people's experiences with harm, but those tend to not get used very much, as I'll talk about a little bit later. On the other hand, we can develop very specific protections for particular populations or user groups, but there are so many populations and different ways in which they might experience harm that this could become just as unwieldy as the space of digital safety itself. So we have to find this sweet spot in the middle where we generalize perhaps just enough for the protections we develop to apply to multiple experiences that people could have, but not so much that they're no longer useful because they lack any sort of context. In this talk, I'll introduce one example of an abstraction over related goals, actions, harms, and risk factors that sits in the sweet spot that I have done some work in. And to better understand how to protect users within this abstraction from the harm that they experience, we'll also look at their protective behaviors or the ways in which they're already trying to protect themselves, as I believe that this can tell us a lot about their preferences for particular strategies or approaches. The abstraction that I'm going to focus on in this talk is an algorithmically mediated offline introduction, or an AMOI for short, because that is a mouthful. Now, an AMOI is an offline introduction between strangers that is brokered by a matching algorithm on an app or a website. One example of an AMOI is online dating. So in online dating, two people are matched up by an algorithm that thinks that they might be compatible for a variety of reasons, such as where they're living, their race, their religious beliefs, their gender. But eventually, these people want to meet up offline, and that's where they're going to carry out the majority of their interaction. Another example of an AMOI is gig work. So in gig work, many people are workers and clients are interacting, often in close proximity within physical spaces. So spaces like a driver's vehicle or a client's home. So this talk is going to be about AMOIs broadly. But before we do that, I want to tell you about one project where we looked at a specific group of people who engage in AMOIs that inspired the broader abstraction that I'll get to in the second part of the talk. This first project was published at CHI in 2022, and we looked at how women gig workers experience and cope with bias and harassment. And we were specifically interested in how their experiences with bias and harassment are shaped by both their gender and the design of the platform. During the talk, I'm just going to be skimming the surface of what we found in this paper. So if you're interested in learning more about what we did and what we found, then I encourage you to read the paper. In this project, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 20 women gig workers in North America, working in ride sharing, food delivery, and various in-home tasks. The in-home tasks that people worked in were a variety of domestic type work. So things like cleaning, building furniture, moving furniture, and caretaking. So taking care of perhaps elderly family members or young children. We focused on these three types of gig work because they represent a varied level of interaction between workers and clients, as well as differences in terms of who owns the space in which the interaction occurs. For example, ride sharing is considered a high interaction type of interaction because workers and clients, so drivers and passengers, are interacting with one another for a fairly long amount of time in very close proximity. And the location in which they're interacting is the driver's vehicle. So this is the worker's space. We first found that societal gender roles and dynamics beyond the platform impact how safe women workers feel on the platform. So now I'm going to share a few examples, some quotes from our participants that illustrate this result. One food courier, Eileen, who we talked to, explained that at the end of her shift, she is often followed home by strangers who want to yell at her for how she's driving. She told us that she's trans and that when she presented as a man, this wasn't a problem. But now that she's presenting as a woman, she says, I am now regarded as no threat. Would someone ever do this if I was a guy? I don't think so. So we see that social dynamics around how women are perceived in society might lead to situations where Eileen feels unsafe while delivering food to clients. Another worker, Constance, who works for TaskRabbit doing a variety of different in-home tasks, explained that she feels that her physical strength, as well as her size, give her confidence in unsafe situations. In college, I played rugby for 4 years and I've tackled some pretty large and tall people. If I didn't have the background that I have, if I were a smaller woman, it would have been very uncomfortable to have a man 6 inches away from me the entire time I was working. We also found that workers' ability to protect themselves from in unsafe situations is impacted by the design of the platform and how the platform addresses harm, as well as workers' power on the platform. Gig work platforms assign work based on prior work history as well as ratings. And so this means that the higher ratings a worker has, the more access to work they're going to have, or more access to higher paying work. And this dynamic limits workers' safety behaviors because the consequence of their actions on the platform is going to become very strongly linked to their standing on the platform and therefore their overall financial stability. One of our participants described the process that goes through her head when she's deciding how to deal with a situation where she feels threatened or unsafe around a client. She said, at the end of the day, you are dealing with something you might not necessarily do in the real world. In certain situations, it's just not worth standing up for yourself because if you do and they give you a bad rating, it's not like Uber reaches out to you to get clarification on the issue. So we see that these rating-based assignment mechanisms really limit workers' responses. And in addition to that, we also see that the fact that there's very limited built-in structure to contain harm within gig work platforms also limits workers' responses. For example, there is no anti-harassment policies to protect workers that they can fall back on. Oftentimes, reporting policies might also be fairly unsupportive or nebulous, so workers don't necessarily know whether the time that they're going to take to make reports or whether the emotional whether or not they'll have the emotional bandwidth to resurface prior trauma if it's not going to go anywhere. All that stuff really impact how they're going to think about reporting harm to platforms. So instead, in these situations, women workers try to de-escalate the situation by brushing off the perpetrator's actions or by playing along for the remainder of the interaction because they're too afraid to do anything else. This study inspired the broader abstraction of AMOIs that I talked about earlier in the talk. Our first finding from this work was that social context affects safety, perhaps because of the offline nature of the work. So we sought to understand how other groups of people that use technology in similar ways to mediate intentionally offline interactions might have similar experiences. The second finding from this work was that platform design affects people's protective behaviors. So we sought to understand how people are protecting themselves and how this dynamic might also arise in other AMOIs. In this work, we looked at not only gig workers, but also online daters and sex workers as well. And there has been a lot of work in this space looking at the various harms that people experience in AMOIs and the behaviors that they're engaging in across multiple research communities. But there has not been a lot of synthesis on which harms are more important to people or which behaviors people engage in the most. And this can be kind of hard to parse as well because all the research has been spread out across these various communities. So with this project, we had two goals. The first was to systematize the harms that have been considered in prior work and to measure the salience of those in people's definitions of safety within AMOI. And the second goal was to systematize the behaviors that have been considered in prior work and to measure both the prevalence of adoption of those behaviors as well as the prevalence of the resources and mechanisms that people are using to carry out those behaviors. The paper for this project is currently under review at CSCW 2024, but if anyone is interested, feel free to send me an email or come talk to me afterwards, and I'm happy to share preprint. We conducted a systematic lit review of 93 papers and then a survey of about 1,000 respondents. We first examined literature across 5 research domains: HCI, security, criminology, psychology, and sociology to understand the harms, actors, and protective behaviors that have been studied among three groups who engage in AMOIs: online daters, gig workers, and sex workers. We then ran a survey with close to 1,000 online daters and gig workers combined to conduct a summative evaluation of our conceptual framework. And with this evaluation, we were really focused on trying to understand what is the salience of harms in people's definitions of safety, what are the harms that they've experienced, what are the behaviors that they're engaging in to protect themselves from these harms, and what are the mechanisms and resources that they're using to carry out these behaviors. For the survey, we focused just on online daters and gig workers because those were the easiest populations for us to recruit a very large sample from. So we wanted to include online sex workers as well, but unfortunately we did not have easy access to hundreds of sex workers for the survey. Like I alluded to earlier, prior work hadn't quantified the importance of specific harms to people when they think about safety in AMOIs, nor the prevalence of the behaviors that they're engaging in. So we did this with a survey of 476 online daters and 451 gig workers. We recruited online daters from Prolific, which is a crowdsourcing platform, as well as from Lucid, which is a marketplace for survey panels. We ran the online dating survey first, and we were noticing some quality issues with our responses from Lucid. And so after only taking the responses that we thought were high quality, we decided that for gig workers, we were only going to recruit participants from Prolific, where responses were of better quality. The questions in our survey fell into three categories. The first is how people define safety. The second is what kind of harm have they experienced? And the third, what protective behaviors are they engaging in and what resources and mechanisms are they using to carry those out? Most of the questions that we asked were multiple response questions. The only open response question that we had was the question on how people define safety. And we thought that here, because this was perhaps a more question that would lead to more nuanced responses, we really wanted to keep that one open-ended. But for the other ones, just because of the scale of the survey that we were working with, it would be perhaps unreasonable to have 1,000 open-ended responses across multiple questions and qualitatively code all of that. And all of our questions and answer choices for these multiple response questions were informed from our lit review. I'll first present our conceptual framework of harms and AMOIs, which again is the result of our lit review. And then I'll follow that up with takeaways from looking at respondents' definitions of safety and measuring the salience of harm in those responses. Then after we go through all the harms, I'll do the same for the behaviors. We identified 5 harms that people who engage in AMOIs experience according to prior work. And by looking at this collective body of knowledge, we also saw how these harms have been defined previously. So these are the 5 harms that we put together from doing this lit review. And I'll go through each of them and define what each of these definitions are. The first is physical harm. Physical harm is bodily harm that might result from assault, abuse, or disease. Financial harm results from fraud, internet scams, and can also be the result, just broader financial instability that results from these various types of financial harm. Privacy harms are misuse and abuse of personal information that's provided to platforms. People who engage in AMOIs provide a bunch of personal information to platforms to generate matches. And so this a concern here is that this information could be abused in various ways if it fell into the hands of a malicious actor. Autonomy harms are the result of controlling what someone can and cannot do. This can be done by both platforms and people. For example, there's been a lot of prior work in sex work that looks at how sex workers are deplatformed or completely banned from certain sites because of the work that they do. There's also been a huge body of work in gig work looking at algorithmic management and how opaque systems that the managed workers might inhibit what their day-to-day looks like and kind of the power that they might have. Autonomy harms also refer to harms that result from lack of transparency over platforms' use of personal data. If people don't have insight into how platforms collect and use their data, then they don't have much control over how those decisions are made. And then emotional harm is the consequence on people's mental health or mental states of these various harms occurring. So perhaps the anxiety or the fear that results from having experienced these types of harms or other harms like hate and harassment. Emotional harm can also be the result, or it can also be caused by fear over future harm. So if someone is concerned that they might experience one of these harms if they were to engage in a particular interaction, that would also be an example of an emotional harm. We saw that, interestingly, even though we were focused on the specific context of AMOIs, the harms in this framework align with other frameworks that people have written about. For example, Schuerman et al.'s framework on the severity of harmful online content, as well as Citron and Solov's framework on the privacy harms that people experience in contract law. But we also saw that previous taxonomies and other work that has defined these types of harms in AMOIs has done so through a much more digital first lens than how people define some of these harms themselves. So by asking our respondents in our survey how they define safety in AMOIs, we were able to add a bit more nuance to existing definitions. For example, looking at financial harm, we saw examples of people being concerned about things like internet scams, for example, romance or labor scams that might occur on the platform. But we primarily saw examples of people expressing concern over really physical forms of financial harm, like physical robbery. So one participant defined safety as the fact that they do not get harmed or robbed while being out. Looking over at autonomy harm, we also saw a similar dynamic. Rather than an emphasis on a lack of transparency around data collection and use, people were really concerned around their freedom of movement being restricted in physical spaces. One participant said, "It is important to always have an escape plan and ensure that you don't get stuck." We wanted to further understand which of these harms are most important to people by measuring the salience of each of their definitions of safety. So what we did was we qualitatively coded the definitions that people were providing through a deductive approach, where we used the categories and definitions from our conceptual framework as the codes that we used to do the coding. And through this process, we found that emotional harm is the most salient concern in online daters' definitions of safety, and that physical harm is the most salient concern in gig workers' definitions of safety. And then we transitioned over to looking at the harms that people actually reported experiencing. And what we found was that the salience of harms in their definitions doesn't always align with the prevalence of their reported harms. For example, in online dating, we saw that emotional and autonomy harms were consistent with definitions. So emotional harm was the most reported. It was also the one that online daters are most concerned about. Autonomy harm was the second most reported among online daters. And we also saw, going back to the previous slide, that a good number of people were also experiencing autonomy, were also concerned about autonomy harms, about a quarter of our respondents. Interestingly, we saw that privacy harm among online daters was not very commonly reported. Only about 9% of our respondents reported privacy harms, even though about a quarter of them mentioned these as concerns in their definitions of safety. Now, looking over at gig workers, we saw that financial harm is the most reported, despite it being the least salient in their definitions of safety. So like very few people, I think just about like a little bit under 8% of gig workers were mentioning financial harm in their definitions, but over 41% were actually experiencing it. And then we saw that physical harm is the second to least reported, despite it being the one that was most salient in gig workers' definitions of safety. And then consistent with their definitions, yes. Yeah, so for both groups, one concern that was commonly expressed was like, I don't want to be in a situation where I can't exit the location. So for example, like an online dater might be concerned of like, I don't want someone to pick me up for this date because I don't want to be like trapped in their car and not be able to get out. For gig workers, oftentimes they would say things like, safety to me means being able to know how to get out of the house ahead of time in case something were to feel unsafe. So yeah, like I said, consistent with definitions, privacy harm was the one that was least reported for gig workers. And so I think beyond these being interesting findings, I think there are also implications for how we ask about harm in studies. So I think that this tells us that asking people to define safety or to tell us what harms are most concerning might surface very different responses than asking them to report what harms they've experienced. And so one takeaway from this is that we can't necessarily use one as a proxy for the other. Measuring the salience of harms in respondents' safety definitions also allowed us to surface discrepancies between their most salient concerns and what prior work has focused on the most. We saw that financial harm is perhaps overly focused on in both online dating and gig work literature, relative to the more salient harms that people are actually more concerned about. So there's been a lot of work on romance scams in online dating and labor scams in gig work, especially in the context of online crowd work. And while people do mention these, they're not mentioning them to the extent to which they're being studied. We also saw that autonomy harm might be under-focused on in online dating literature. Interestingly, it is much more focused on in gig work literature. So like I said previously, there's a lot of work on algorithmic management in the context of gig work. But there's not a lot of similar work being done in online dating, even though about a quarter of people expressed concerns around autonomy harms in online dating. And also very few, or actually a lot of people were experiencing autonomy harms in online dating as well, as we saw earlier. So it is a space where perhaps we need to focus on a little bit more. So now I'm going to transition over to talking about the behaviors that people are using to mitigate these types of harms. And so similarly to the harms, I'm going to begin by presenting our conceptual framework, and then I'll share some interesting takeaways that we can perhaps use to think about how we might design to support people's protective behaviors. Now, safety is important, and I think we can all get behind that. And I think that people who build technology agree as well. There exist several safety apps that have been explicitly designed to support people's safety. Examples of these include things like wearable alarm apps, so maybe like bracelets that have a button that when you press it, it makes a loud noise or maybe calls law enforcement. Also various apps that allow people to share their current location. But these support safety broadly and not in any particular interaction or use case necessarily. We wanted to understand, like, how are people using these? Do they fit into people's safety workflow and how? So we gave respondents a list of the 8 most commonly discussed safety apps that we found across various online articles in the news to understand which of these have they heard of, which of these can they explain the functionality of to someone else, and which of these do they use themselves. And we found that surprisingly very few people know about these and much less use them at all. So only about like 4.5% of online daters said that they use any of these safety apps, and even fewer gig workers said the same. Now, our work doesn't look at why this is happening. So this is an area that's open for research. Maybe it's a marketing problem, or maybe the tools don't do what people need them to do because they're too general. But what we took away from this is that before we continue building and perhaps building more tools, we need to understand what it is that people are actually doing. So from the literature, we identified 10 protective behaviors that people are using to mitigate the 5 harms I presented earlier. And they're engaging in these behaviors across 3 stages of interaction: before an offline meeting, during an offline meeting, and after an offline meeting. And so I'm going to go through all 10 behaviors here. I'll present all 10, but I'm not going to give definitions for all 10 just because that would take too much time. I'll instead focus on the ones that are going to be relevant to the later parts of the talk. So before people engage in an offline meeting, they're engaging in self-disclosure, obfuscation, screening, and vetting. Self-disclosure and obfuscation involves strategic revealing and hiding of information that people feel would make an offline meetup safer. This is also, we saw that this is very common in the LGBTQ dating literature. Screening is using information that is provided by the platform to decide whether or not someone is going to be safe to meet. So this oftentimes involves just looking through someone's profile and deciding like whether or not that there's someone who might cause them harm. And then vetting is a behavior in which people triangulate information from the platform, so information that they use while screening, with information that they find themselves about the individual, perhaps from other online accounts, or information that they might obtain from people who they ask, like, hey, do you know this person? Like, what has been your experience with this person? Or perhaps information gathered from like online communities or forums where people band together for support. Then during the meeting, people engage in environmental precautions, covering, emergency alerts, and surveillance and documentation. Environmental precautions are a variety of proactive steps that people engage in to preserve their autonomy. For example, it might mean bringing protective items like pepper spray to a meeting, or trying to control when and where the meeting occurs, not meeting in a certain location, or deciding that you won't meet people after a certain time of day. Covering is essentially the buddy system. So this involves giving information about the meeting to a trusted contact. Things like telling them, this is who I'm going to meet. This is where I'm going to meet them. If I don't come back by this time, please do X thing. It might also involve bringing a trusted contact to the meeting and having them wait in the car. Then post-meeting, people engage in blocking and reporting. And reporting involves two kinds of behaviors, actually. The first is reporting the harm to authorities or to the platform trying to seek some form of justice, but it might also involve reporting the harm to various social networks to warn other people who might engage with the person and to receive emotional support as well. These 10 behaviors fall along a spectrum in how they're carried out. Some, like environmental precautions, are carried out individually, and some, like covering, are a bit more social, while others, like vetting, can kind of fall somewhere in the middle. They can either be individual or they could be social, or kind of a combination of both. Some individual behaviors are completely independent from the platform, but others do rely on the platform. For example, screening depends on the information that's provided by the platform about an individual, and blocking depends on whether or not a platform has a blocking mechanism implemented. We saw that the most prevalent behaviors are screening and vetting. And these are individual behaviors that are easy to carry out. So they don't necessarily require specialized tools, and people can carry them out with the things that they have available. In screening, we saw that most commonly people are trying to determine whether or not someone has enough information about them on the platform in order to conduct an offline search. So in order to engage in vetting. So really what they're looking for are, do people have a like blank profile or not? Or like, do people present a profile picture? In environmental precautions, we saw that people are most commonly being selective about the meeting location and time, and also engaging in advanced planning. For example, trying to route out an escape route, or trying to figure out like what the nearest like police station is. We also saw that social behaviors are really highly prevalent. Over 75% of people in both groups engage in vetting, covering, and reporting. And while it makes sense that vetting and covering are social activities, it wasn't immediately obvious to us that reporting was also a social activity. But when we dug in a little bit further, we saw that even though nearly everyone is saying that they're reporting harmful experiences after they occur, very few people are actually reporting these experiences through formal channels, like back to the platform or to law enforcement or to other like safety organizations. Instead, these reports are being made outside formal channels via private or closed online communities or whisper networks. And one reason for this might be that maybe people don't know if or how their reports are going to be actioned, like I mentioned back when we were talking about the study on women gig workers. What I think this points to is perhaps an opportunity to support collective safety, which is something that I will talk about when I present some of the work that I'm currently working on. Finally, some behaviors like self-disclosure, obfuscation, and blocking require certain platform affordances. And we see that these behaviors are the ones that are least prevalent and also the ones where we observe the greatest differences between online daters and gig workers, perhaps because of differences between the affordances offered by gig work and dating platforms. We see that higher rates of these among online daters because a lot of gig work platforms might not allow workers, for example, a lot of control over their profile on the app. Also, a lot of gig work platforms don't necessarily have blocking mechanisms. So the workers that we see saying that they're engaging in these behaviors might be doing so outside the platform. For example, blocking someone from being able to contact them on their personal device rather than on the app itself. But that doesn't stop someone from being able to contact them on the app. So overall, through both pieces of work, we see that in AMOIs, people are vulnerable, but they're not helpless. They are engaging in many different kinds of behaviors to try to protect themselves already, especially when existing tools might not meet those needs. And so it is our belief that we can learn from their protective behaviors to inform the design of future safety mitigations, especially when we consider their protective behaviors over an abstraction of related experiences. Now I want to discuss some of my ongoing work and open research areas. One of the things that I'm really interested in right now is translating the results of my academic work into results that are interesting and useful from a policy perspective as well. So to this end, we've had some discussions with the White House Gender Policy Council on how the results of our work on AMOIs might be used to address tech-facilitated gender-based violence. And we're also currently translating our academic paper on AMOIs into a policy-facing white paper that can help support this aim. We've also used the results of our work to inform NIST on best practices for generative AI safety. So in response to NIST's AI executive order request for information, we leverage our findings on the low prevalence of formal reporting structures to suggest cross-institutional and more transparent harm reporting structures that can be used to both support people's safety, but also inform system designers about new harms in emerging technologies like generative AI. I talked previously about the high prevalence with which people in AMOIs are reporting harm via closed private online communities. The communication and interaction in these networks is very similar to that of offline whisper networks. So offline whisper networks, this is a term that emerged during the Me Too movement and describes behavior where people, typically women, share stories of sexual harassment and abuse with one another to warn each other and to seek support. And online communities allow people to engage in similar interactions but on a much larger scale. So for example, there's been some work previously in HCI done by Angelica Strohmeyer looking at like bad date lists or bad client lists in sex work. But not so much looking at how people are using online spaces with large numbers of people to have these sorts of interactions and communicate about these experiences. So this introduces, I think, potential harms and security issues because sharing stories of abuse and trauma with hundreds or thousands of people in the group isn't necessarily the same thing as sharing offline one-on-one where you can personally vet the individual that you're sharing to. It risks information being perhaps leaked back to a perpetrator or maybe putting people at increased risk of online hate and harassment from the vulnerable stories that they're sharing. So one of the things that I'm interested in is thinking about how can we design online communities where people are able to discuss and share these types of stories and support one another safely. So to do that, I'm currently starting some interviews with various people who engage in communication via whisper networks. These include online daters, gig workers, sex workers, workers in specific industries, so like academia, law, and medicine, and also people in niche communities, so like people in the furry community, for example. And we're interested in just trying to understand, how do people use digital tools to report their experiences and warn other people about potential perpetrators? What risks do they face in sharing sensitive information digitally? And how do they decide what to share and with whom? I'm also interested in thinking about how different sources of power influence the protections that platforms can reasonably develop. Oftentimes in HCI research, we present design implications for platforms without necessarily considering some of the constraints with which platforms operate. So for example, many elder care platforms that are used to find workers to support the needs of older adults work with Medicare and Medi-Cal, which limits some of the actions that platforms can reasonably take against abusive clients. So for example, it makes it harder to simply kick a client off the platform when they're harassing, let's say, a worker. So to understand this dynamic a little bit further, an undergraduate student at Georgetown, Annika Lin, who I co-advise with Alyssa Redmiles and Katie Wells, also from Georgetown, she's looking at how elder care platforms support worker safety. And so together we're looking at what features are used by elder care platforms to support worker safety, because a lot of them are actually trying to implement protections, but we're not quite sure necessarily like how they're being implemented or how they're working with workers' needs. We're also interested in what are workers' mental models of how the features that these platforms are building operate, and how do the features align with their safety concerns. And then finally, we're interested in how does the regulatory landscape around elder care platforms impact the protections that platforms can offer. And we're doing this through a variety of app audits, content analysis of worker forums, and interviews with elder care workers themselves. Now, the two projects that I just presented, they fall within this broader space, this broader research agenda I have of trying to understand how can we support collective and decentralized protection for safety, and how do we mitigate harm across multiple power differentials. Something else I'm interested in as well, but didn't get around to talking to today, is how do we use the tools from security to support more defensive safety protection, and just broadly trying to think about how can we prevent harm from happening in the first place. For example, is there a way in which we can model harms like those experienced in AMOIs as a spam or phishing detection problem? And if so, is there a way for us to more proactively help people identify harmful situations up front before harm occurs? Another area that I think would be really interesting is thinking about how do we threat model systems like these are very complex, they're very nuanced, where people are using the system for many different reasons and experiencing different types of harm in them, to allow system designers to try to anticipate more easily the types of harms that people could experience depending on their use of the system. And so with that, I'm going to end here and take any questions. I'm happy to chat further.